At a high-end gala, my parents stood tucked behind kitchen wings carrying wine trays for my brother Anthony's guests, while he bowed to a billionaire whispering they were just senile servants. My father's trembling hands dropped a crystal glass, and my brother hissed they were useless trash right before my eyes, but he does not know I recorded it. Hello, I am Major Alicia. Stay with me tonight to see how I reclaim justice for my parents. Like this, if you believe a parent's dignity is priceless. I stood in the center of the kitchen of Anthony, staring at the polished Italian marble, but the room did not smell like the home I remembered. There was no scent of the cornbread my mother used to bake every Sunday, or the warm aroma of coffee that used to greet me. Instead, it smelled of cold industrial bleach and a sterile silence that felt heavier than a winter fog. This house cost $1.2 million, and every inch of it was designed to impress strangers, while our parents were tucked away in the shadows. Right under the curve of the grand staircase where nobody would look, my parents sat on two old wooden chairs caked with sawdust from the sawmill they used to own. My father stood there in a tattered sweater from the 90s, watching Anthony pour a $1,000 bottle of wine for a stranger. My mother Maureen was on her hands and knees scrubbing a spot on the floor, using the harsh, cheap chemicals Tiffany forced her to use. Anthony leaned in close to Julian, his voice honeyed and submissive, discussing a real estate project. He said, "Yes, sir," and "Right away, sir," with a grin that reached his eyes until the moment Julian stepped away to use the restroom. Then the light in the face of my brother vanished like a bulb flickering out. My father let out a small, ragged cough because of the dust, and Anthony turned on him with a hiss. He asked if my father could just keep his mouth shut for once because that man was the only thing that could save his company. He pushed a $10 bill toward my mother and told her to go get more ice, but he leaned in close to make sure she heard the rest. He told her not to use the front door because he did not want anyone seeing her looking like an old woman who picked through garbage for a living. I stood in the darkness of the hallway, my hands clenched so tight, my knuckles turned white, unable to believe that the man so polite to a stranger could be this cruel to his own mother. I looked at my parents, who used to be the king and queen of the Campbell sawmill, and saw how they had been shrunk into ghosts in the kingdom of their son. Anthony and Tiffany had turned them into unpaid servants, using the silence of my parents to fuel their own hollow vanity. I wondered when exactly it became okay for the new SUV insurance of my brother to be paid for by the $1,200 monthly pension of my father, while my father did not even have $20 for a bottle of cough medicine. This was the reality I had missed during my years of service, and it felt heavier than any pack I had ever carried. My mother picked up that $10 bill without saying a word and walked toward the back door of that massive house. I watched her step out into the biting Denver wind, her shoulders hunched as if she was carrying the entire weight of the shame of her son on her back. Watching my father Fletcher stand there with trembling hands serving those wine trays, I cannot help but see his hands from 20 years ago. Those were the hands that held an axe with such strength and built a legacy from raw oak with nothing but sweat and determination. They were the hands that nurtured the dreams of a man who now looks at him as nothing more than a used tool to be discarded. It is a memory that burns in my mind every time I see him flinch at the sound of his own son's voice. If I close my eyes, I can still see the Campbell sawmill back in 2005. The air was thick with the rich scent of fresh sawdust and the honest smell of my father. We were the symbol of the working middle class in the suburbs of Denver. My father always sat at the head of the table during our Sunday dinners, proudly talking about the lumber shipments headed for California, while we ate pot roast and shared stories. Anthony was the prince of that sawmill. He was always the favorite of my mother Maureen, and she wanted him to have the world. She eventually sold her only diamond ring, which was a precious heirloom from my grandmother, just to get $5,000 for his law school deposit. I remember her whispering to me that Anthony was smart, and he would bring honor to our family name. She sacrificed her last bit of pride to buy a future for a man who would eventually betray her. I remember the day Anthony graduated from law school so clearly. He hugged our mother with tears in his eyes and promised her that once he was rich, she would never have to touch dishwater again. He told her he would build them the biggest house in Denver, and they would live the life they truly earned. Back then, that promise sounded so sweet, like honey drizzled over a fresh plank of oak. My father Fletcher just laughed and clapped his son on the shoulder with a heavy palm. He was so proud that he signed over the sawmill and our old family home, which was a lifetime of work worth $450,000. He gave it all to Anthony as startup capital because he believed in the bond of blood. He did not keep a single penny for himself because he trusted his son with his entire life. Looking back at this bitter truth, I feel so foolish for staying silent during my 12 years in the service. I thought Anthony was actually keeping those promises while I was away at my post, but he did not build a home for our parents. He used that $450,000 to buy his way into high society and turned our parents into guests on their own land. The sacrifice my mother made is now treated by Anthony as if it were a mandatory debt she owed him. He forgot about the diamond ring and the nights she stayed up late sewing his clothes for school. All he sees now are profit margins, and he treats them like an embarrassment to his new polished company image. I walked into the old sawmill recently, but it was not a place of creation anymore. Anthony had turned it into a junk warehouse for his business. My father's old saw table was still sitting there buried under a layer of dust so thick you could not even see the grain of the wood. I touched the cold surface, and my heart tightened, thinking about how a man who once managed dozens of workers now has to bow his head and ask Anthony for a few dollars just to buy a pack of cigarettes. My father used to take so much pride in his old white Ford F-150, but now it sits rusting in the backyard, while Anthony drives a polished Mercedes he bought with the money from the very last load of lumber my father ever sold. But verbal cruelty was only the beginning of the heartless neglect. 3 days after the gala, when the first cold snap hit Denver, the attic where they were forced to live became a death trap. I heard a dry thud at 2 in the morning, and my instincts took over. I ran up the stairs to find my father Fletcher lying on the cold floor, clutching an empty inhaler in his hand. His face was turning a terrifying shade of purple as he struggled for a single breath of air in the middle of an acute asthma attack. I rushed downstairs and pounded on the door of the bedroom of Anthony. He opened it looking annoyed and told me that he had a meeting with Julian in the morning and could not be disturbed. He said that Dad was just old and it was normal for him to be short of breath, and told me to just give him some warm water. Then he slammed the door shut, leaving his own father on the verge of death because he did not want to lose an hour of sleep before a business meeting. I stood there in front of the expensive oak door of Anthony, feeling a cold fire rising in my chest. My brother had spent $12 on a latte that morning, but he refused to spend $35 on a new inhaler for our father. He told our mother that medicine was too expensive and that they needed to learn to take care of themselves. I looked at the watery soup with just a few kernels of corn sitting by the bed of my father, which Tiffany called a healthy diet for the elderly. It was a systematic starvation hidden behind a smile. My mother Maureen sat on the floor holding the cold feet of my father, her eyes empty, as if she had already died inside. I picked up my father, and it shocked me how light he felt, as if his very substance was fading away. His ribs were sticking out under his worn shirt like a skeleton. I did not call Anthony again because I knew he was already gone. I drove through the dark night to the emergency room alone. While my father was on oxygen, my phone buzzed with a notification. Tiffany had just posted a photo of a new jewelry set on Instagram with a caption about treating herself after a long day of taking care of the family. The lack of morality made me shiver. They used the pension of my father to polish their own image while leaving him to suffocate for lack of a cheap inhaler. Sitting in the hospital waiting room, I looked at the scars on my hands from my years of service, and I realized that enough was enough. I had spent my youth protecting the front lines, but I had allowed my own parents to be crushed by the monster we had raised. Anthony was wrong to think I was just a daughter who followed orders. He has not seen the true strength of Major Alicia when she commits to a duty of honor. I held the hand of my father and swore that this was the last time he would ever be treated with such contempt. I do not know if anyone listening has ever had to swallow their tears while watching a loved one be ignored by family in their hour of need. The feeling when you call for help and they turn away is a wound deeper than any physical pain. If you have ever had a moment where you finally said, "Enough is enough," please tell me your story in the comments so I know my parents are not alone. And like this, if you believe that ignoring your parents is the greatest crime. When the entire world of my parents seemed to collapse under the crushing cruelty of Anthony, a sudden light appeared from a place I least expected. The billionaire Julian Blackwood was the man my brother worshipped as if he were a god, yet he was the first person to realize that the people Anthony treated as invisible servants at the gala were actually the true heart of this story. He saw the dignity that blood was too blinded to recognize. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, and for the first time in years, someone was looking at my mother and father not as a burden, but as people who truly mattered. Early the next morning, right after I had brought my father home from the sterile white walls of the emergency room, a sleek black luxury car pulled up to the curb. It was not my brother coming to check on his father, but a private assistant from Julian Blackwood's office. He did not come with a contract or a business proposal. He carried a large basket of fresh fruit and a box containing the highest quality asthma medication available in the world. The assistant walked straight past Anthony, who was already hovering at the door with a desperate, fawning smile on his face. Julian did not even glance at him. He walked directly to where my father Fletcher was sitting, and he did something that made time stand still. He bowed his head with the genuine respect of a man greeting a mentor. Julian told my father that he had spent weeks researching the Campbell sawmill and realized that the very desks and chairs in his own executive office were pieces my father had crafted 20 years ago. He told him they were still as strong and elegant as the day they were made, just like the man who had created them. I watched Anthony stand frozen by the doorway, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He was watching the man he had spent years trying to impress ignore him completely to kneel on one knee beside the old wooden chair of my father. Julian did not look at the expensive renovations or the Italian marble my brother bragged about. Instead, he spoke softly to my father about the importance of recovery and strength. Julian then informed his private secretary right there in our living room to arrange a chartered flight to a premier rehabilitation center in Florida. He wanted my father to have the best respiratory care and the exact humidity levels required for his lungs to heal properly. It was a silent and devastating indictment against my brother, who had suggested warm water for a man who was suffocating. Then Julian turned his attention to my mother Maureen. I saw her eyes well up with tears, because it had been a very long time since anyone had addressed her as Mrs. Maureen with such profound sincerity. He did not ask her about the housework or the cleaning schedule Tiffany forced upon her. He asked her about the lavender tea she had served at the gala. He told her that the tea had a soul and that it reminded him of the warmth of a real family, which was something he had not felt in a long time. I could see my mother coming back to life right before my eyes. The invisibility that Anthony had cast over her for 2 years began to shatter because a stranger chose to see her. She stood a little taller, and the way she held her shoulders changed as she realized her worth was not defined by the tasks she performed for an ungrateful son. Before he left, Julian pulled a black VIP card from his pocket and placed it directly into my hand right in front of Anthony. He told me clearly that every single expense for the treatment and the stay for my parents would be handled by his personal office. He looked my brother directly in the eyes with a cold and sharp stare that made Anthony wither. Julian told him that he was not interested in investing in the empty projects of my brother, but that he was investing in the legacy of Mr. Fletcher Campbell. He told Anthony that a man should learn how to care for the roots of his family before he expects to harvest any of the fruit. In that one moment, Anthony lost the control he had used as a cage for our parents. He was no longer the master of the house, but a small man caught in a massive lie. I felt a mixture of deep gratitude and a biting sense of shame. I was ashamed because our own family had failed to do the simple thing of buying an inhaler, and it took a stranger to step in and protect the dignity of my parents. Julian looked at me and his eyes seemed to understand everything without me saying a word. He did not give a lecture or a speech. He simply did what a human being with a conscience is supposed to do. I realized then that kindness does not require a blood relation, and that sometimes your true family consists of the people who choose to stand by you when the night is at its darkest. My years of service had taught me about duty, but Julian was teaching me about the power of a quiet hand reaching out to pull someone from the depths. The room was left filled with the scent of fresh fruit and the smell of new hope. For the first time in years, my father Fletcher sat up straight in his chair, and I saw a spark in his eyes that I thought had gone out back at the sawmill. Julian had left us with more than just medicine and a flight. He had given us the armor of being seen. Anthony stood there staring at the VIP card in my hand, with a look of pure hunger mixed with terror. He was beginning to realize that the games he had played were finally coming to an end because he had met an opponent who could not be bought with flattery. The light had finally broken through the ceiling of that attic, and the truth was starting to breathe again. After Julian left, the air in that attic felt a little less suffocating, but I knew that medication could only save the body. Their souls needed to be woken up by the feeling that they still had some control over their own lives. On Saturday morning, I did not ask for permission from Tiffany. I simply took my car keys and helped my parents walk out through the front door. It was the door they had only been allowed to look through from a tiny crack for the last 2 years. I could feel them trembling as we stepped onto the porch, but I did not stop. I could see the neighbors looking, and for the first time I did not care about the appearances Anthony worked so hard to maintain. We were stepping out of the shadows and into the bright Colorado sun. We pulled into the parking lot of Safeway, where my mother Maureen had been a regular for 30 years. She froze for a second in front of the automatic glass doors, her shoulders hunched, and her eyes darting around as if she expected Anthony or Tiffany to jump out and scream at her for daring to leave the house without asking. I held her thin hand and guided her to a shopping cart. At first, her hands shook so much she did not want to touch anything that looked expensive. I had to lean in and encourage her, telling her that today we were going to find the best Granny Smith apples to make a pie, just like she used to do for us. When she finally reached out and picked up a bag of apples and placed it in the cart, I saw a tiny spark of life return to her clouded eyes. She began to look at the shelves, not with fear, but with the familiarity of a woman who had run a household for decades. I walked my father Fletcher over to the tool and gardening aisle while my mother looked at the produce. He stood there in front of the shiny handsaws, and his rough, scarred hands reached out to stroke the wooden handles with such tenderness. Anthony had spent months telling him he was too senile to touch anything sharp, but here in the middle of the fresh scent of pine, my father seemed to grow 10 years younger. He started telling me exactly how to tell the difference between oak and maple, and his voice was no longer short of breath, but clear and steady. The memory loss that Anthony kept talking about was nothing but a fog that had been forced upon him by neglect. When my father picked up a small chisel and checked the sharpness of the blade with his thumb, I realized that his kingdom was not that attic. His kingdom was these tools of pride and the honest labor they represented. At the checkout line, I stood there and made sure they could hear the local radio news reporting on the cost of living adjustment for Social Security in 2024. My mother Maureen listened so closely to the reporter, and then she leaned in and whispered to me. She told me that the $1,200 Anthony said she was receiving each month did not seem to match what they were saying on the radio at all. It was the first shock of logic to hit her. She started doing the math in her head, and I could see the moment she realized she was being lied to about her own hard-earned money. Instead of letting me pay, my mother reached into her old, worn wallet and counted out every single dollar bill to pay for those apples. It was not just a shopping trip for her. It was a statement that she still existed, and she still had the right to spend her own money. I watched the backs of my parents as they walked out to the parking lot, and their footsteps were no longer dragging but firm and steady on the pavement. I could feel the transformation happening right there in the afternoon sunlight. They were no longer ghosts in the house of Anthony. They were starting to reappear as independent citizens with a purpose. I realized that this mission to bring them back to life was more important than any military operation I had ever been a part of in my career. It was a struggle for their very essence. As we got into the car, my mother reached over and fastened the seatbelt for my father. It was a simple act of care and attention, but it was filled with a quiet dignity that had been stripped away by the indifference of their son for far too long. Family does not always have to be those of the same blood who treat you like a burden. Sometimes family is the stranger who dares to give you the most honored seat at their table, to remind you that you are still worthy. Julian Blackwood had prepared a new trench for my parents, a place where there was no industrial bleach or the suffocating heat of that attic. Here there was only the scent of lavender and a profound respect that lived in every single gesture. It was a fortress of dignity where the wounds of the heart began to heal through the grace of a man who truly understood the value of kindness. Julian welcomed us at his own private suite in the Marriott Hotel downtown. The space was filled with a warm, golden light from crystal chandeliers casting a glow that felt like a healing energy completely different from the dark, cramped attic my parents had endured for 2 years. The large dining table was covered in a crisp white tablecloth, without a single wrinkle, with silver cutlery that caught the light, and a vase of fresh lavender placed right in the center. Julian did not sit at the head of the table like a powerful billionaire usually would. Instead, he stepped forward and gently pulled out a chair for my mother Maureen and invited my father Fletcher to sit in the place of honor. I watched in silence as the staff bowed to my parents with genuine reverence, not for a tip or out of obligation, but because they saw honored guests of their employer. This was the moment the dignity of my parents was restored through the lens of a society that finally saw them as real people. I saw my father Fletcher look down at the silver cutlery with a look of confusion on his weathered face. For over 2 years since moving into the house of Anthony, my father had only been allowed to eat with plastic spoons and plastic bowls because Tiffany constantly complained she was afraid he would break her expensive china. His scarred hands trembled, and he hesitated to touch the white napkin for fear of staining it. Julian noticed this immediately, but he did not say a word to make my father feel ashamed. Instead, he casually picked up a piece of bread with his hands and broke it in half, telling my father that back at the old sawmills men always ate simply like this. He told him that honesty was the most valuable thing at any table, not polished etiquette. That small act of kindness made the muscles in the face of my father relax, and for the first time I saw him smile a smile that was free of worry or fear. I realized this new family was healing deep wounds by showing my parents they still deserved the best things in life. In the middle of dinner, Julian did something that made my mother unable to hold back her tears. He handed her a high-quality leather-bound notebook and invited her to be a senior advisor for a scholarship fund called the Carpenter's Hands, which was named after my father. My mother was stunned, her hands cracked from harsh chemicals, trembling as she touched the smooth leather and the smell of fresh paper. Julian looked at her with such sincerity and said that his company truly needed the wisdom of a long-time teacher and the empathy of a mother to choose the right children for these opportunities. I saw my mother seem to grow several inches taller in her armchair because she was no longer the senile maid in the stories Anthony told. She was a respected expert again. Being useful and needed is the most powerful medicine for the soul of those who have reached their later years. I sat there watching Julian talk with my parents, and I could not help but think about my brother Anthony. Why could a stranger like Julian see the gold in the souls of my parents, while the own son they sacrificed everything to educate could only see a burden to be hidden away? I began to understand the deep conflict in the heart of Anthony as he held onto a grudge because my parents could not give him a wealthy start 30 years ago. He was using contempt and abuse as a way to punish his own past of being poor. In total contrast, I saw a depth of respect in Julian's eyes that made me wonder if there was a long-lost connection from their youth that he still cherished in silence. This empathy was a solid, invisible trench, shielding my parents from the emotional attacks I knew Anthony would soon launch once he realized they were no longer under his thumb. Toward the end of the evening, Julian handed me a secure leather folder containing the bank records he had used his influence to retrieve from the joint accounts of my parents. As I read the dry numbers on those pages, my heart tightened with a cold rage. There were expenses for $25,000 for a luxury vacation for Tiffany and $15,000 for a set of brand-name golf clubs for Anthony. All of these hollow things were paid for with the money from the sale of the sawmill of my father, a man who did not even have $20 for a bottle of cough medicine. The decision was made right there at that elegant table that we would never be silent again. Julian promised to provide the best legal team in Denver to help me enforce a total freeze on the assets and take back control from Anthony once and for all. The evening ended with the image of my father Fletcher sleeping peacefully on the feather mattress of the hotel suite, his breathing steady and light without the painful whistling of his asthma. My mother Maureen sat quietly by the window looking down at the sparkling lights of Denver, her hand still clutching the notebook Julian had given her, as if she were holding on to a new spark of life for the future. I stood out on the balcony feeling the cold night air, but my heart was filled with a firm determination because I knew I had enough allies and the right evidence for the struggle ahead. The warmth of tonight was the necessary breath before the storm of tomorrow, when we would finally begin to demand justice. I looked into the darkness and knew that those who had trampled on the dignity of my parents would soon have to face the cold, hard truth they had tried to hide for so long. The peace of that evening did not last nearly as long as we had hoped. Anthony did not care whether our parents were living or dying, but he cared deeply that his property had escaped his control. It was a chilling transformation from the son I once knew. When a bank notification from a transaction at Safeway arrived on his phone, and his iCloud tracker showed that our father was no longer in the attic, the monster inside him finally surfaced. He was not looking for them out of love, he was hunting for the assets that fueled his hollow life. It was a systematic stripping of their dignity that he could not allow to end. Anthony burst into my apartment late that night, his face a deep shade of crimson and his breath heavy with expensive wine. He did not ask how our father was doing after the asthma attack. The first words he screamed were about himself. He demanded to know what right I had to take them, and shouted that my actions were ruining his deal with Julian. I stood my ground and blocked his path with the cold gaze of an officer. I asked him if his contracts were truly more important than the life of our father. He just let out a sharp, dry laugh and threw his phone onto the table, showing the Find My app with the blocked location. He hissed through his teeth that our parents were his property under the power of attorney and told me I was essentially kidnapping the elderly. I watched as the mask of the successful lawyer finally shattered into pieces. He was no longer the polite man who bowed to Julian. He began to spit out cruel insults at our mother Maureen right to her face, calling her a senile old woman and asking if she really thought she could leave. He sneered and asked who was going to pay for her medicine if not for his house. I felt the hand of my mother begin to tremble as she tried to retreat into the shadows out of habit, but I reached out and gripped her hand tight. The lack of morality in Anthony had reached its peak as he used the very poverty he forced upon them to keep them terrified. He wanted them to believe they were nothing without his charity. I did not waste any more words. I pulled the bank statements from the leather folder Julian had given me and threw the papers directly at his chest. I asked him where he found the nerve to talk about paying for medicine. I demanded to know where the $40,000 he took from the retirement account of our father went last month. I asked if it went into the expensive handbag Tiffany was showing off on social media, or if it went into his weekend at the golf club. Anthony froze his eyes, darting back and forth as he searched for a new lie. He lunged forward to grab the papers, but I moved with the speed of my training and locked his arm in a firm professional grip. For the first time, the power in the room shifted. The predator finally felt the cold fear of being caught in his own trap. I looked into his vacant eyes and saw a terrifying emptiness. He truly believed that being the eldest son gave him the right to own our parents, as if they were nothing more than a natural resource to be mined. He viewed caring for them as a bad investment, and he was trying to recover his losses by squeezing the last bit of life from them. I felt a cold disgust rising in my throat. I realized then that my brother was never going to feel regret. He only mourned his lost cash cow. His explosion was not driven by family bond, but by the threat to his reputation and his stolen wallet. He was a small man who had traded his soul for a fancy address. Anthony turned to leave, but not before making one final threat. He shouted through the hallway that he would use the law to dump our parents into the cheapest state nursing home in Colorado if I did not return them immediately. He looked at our mother Maureen and asked her if she was really choosing the daughter Alicia who had been away for 12 years over the son who fed her every day. I slammed the door shut with a finality that echoed through the room, cutting off his toxic voice before it could poison the air further. I turned back to look at my mother who was sitting on the edge of the chair. For the first time, she was not crying. She looked at me with a profound sadness and said that she finally saw it. The man who just left was no longer her Anthony. Have you ever had to face a family member who uses your own sacrifices as a tool to manipulate you? That feeling when they return only to demand more instead of showing any remorse is a wound that goes deep into the soul. If you have ever had to set a boundary like I did to protect the dignity of your parents, please tell me your story in the comments. I want to know we are not alone in this fight. And please subscribe to stand with me as I move toward the final moment of justice. Anthony believed the Blackwood Anniversary Gala was his grand stage to finally step into the light he felt he deserved. He was draped in his most expensive tuxedo, looking every bit like the successful Denver lawyer he wanted the world to see, and Tiffany stood beside him in a gown that likely cost more than our father's truck. He was prepared to deliver a speech about family values and the legacy of the Campbell name, using our parents as mere props for his own ambition. He did not know that I had prepared a different kind of stage one, where the truth would be the only light, and it would be bright enough to burn away every mask he had ever worn. I watched him from the shadows of the grand entrance, feeling the weight of my service medals on my chest, and I knew that tonight the silence was finally over. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering crystal chandeliers and the soft hum of chamber music that felt like a thick blanket of artificial grace. I did not enter in a gown or jewels. I walked into that room wearing my major uniform ironed to a sharp edge representing the honor I had spent 12 years defending. Beside me were my father Fletcher and my mother Maureen, dressed in the elegant clothes Julian had provided for them, looking like the king and queen they had always been in my eyes. As we moved toward the center of the hall, a ripple of whispers followed us. I saw Anthony standing next to Julian, holding a glass of vintage wine, and his face turned a ghostly shade of gray when he saw our parents walking through the main doors with their heads held high. He tried to signal the security guards to block us, but Julian simply raised a hand to stop them. His eyes fixed on my brother with an expression that was as sharp as a bayonet. I did not wait for an invitation to speak. Anthony had just finished a rehearsed lie about how caring for his aging parents was his greatest honor, and the audience was still nodding in shallow approval. I stepped onto the podium, and I did not need a microphone to be heard. I used the voice I had forged in a decade of command, a voice that demanded attention without shouting. I looked directly at my brother and asked him if he wanted to show the guests the true nature of that honor on his attic floor. I signaled the technician Julian had provided, and the massive screens designed to show corporate achievements flickered to life with images I had captured. The ballroom went deathly silent as photos of the sweltering, cramped attic, the empty inhaler, and the watery soup filled the room. The video of Tiffany screaming at my mother for being a burden played out in high definition, and I watched the reputation of my brother crumble under his feet like dry sand. Anthony snapped. The polished lawyer disappeared, and he lunged toward the podium with a face twisted by a rage that had been brewing for decades. He did not look at the evidence of his cruelty. He looked at me and screamed that I was a traitor who knew nothing of his burden. Then he turned his venom toward our mother, who was standing perfectly still in the front row. He shouted that she was the one who had ruined his life before he was even born, by choosing a poor woodworker instead of the wealth Julian Blackwood could have given them. This was the secret that had been eating him alive for 30 years. He did not hate them for being old or for the money he stole. He hated them because my mother had chosen love over a kingdom, and he felt he had been cheated out of being a prince. The guests watched in absolute horror as the man who spoke of legacy revealed himself to be a monster of envy. I looked at my mother Marine and saw her face was pale, but her eyes did not turn away. She had kept that secret to protect the man she loved and the family she built, only to have her own son use it as a justification for his abuse. I felt a cold and steady anger realizing that Anthony had spent his life punishing our parents for being happy with what they had. He was a psychological predator who viewed their devotion as a crime against his own greed. The betrayal of emotion was at its peak, because he was not just stealing their retirement, he was trying to invalidate the very love that brought us into this world. He was a hollow man, and in that moment everyone in Denver saw the emptiness where his heart was supposed to be. Julian Blackwood stepped forward, then moving with a calm that made the room feel even smaller. He did not look at Anthony at all. He walked straight to my mother, took the microphone, and spoke to every person in that room. He told them that Marine had made the right choice 30 years ago when she chose dignity and a true heart over his own wealth. He looked at me and said that she had made the right choice again by raising a daughter like Alicia, who knew how to stand for what is right. Then he turned his gaze to Anthony, and his voice was as cold as a mountain peak. He informed my brother that every single contract and agreement between their firms was terminated immediately, and that he would never work with a man who treated his own blood like refuse. Anthony collapsed onto the floor, his expensive tuxedo unable to hide the pathetic reality of a man who had lost everything in a single hour. I stepped down from the podium and took my parents by their hands. The crowd parted like a dark tide as we walked out, and this time there was no whispering, only a profound and respectful silence. I did not feel a sense of triumph, only a deep and aching relief that the truth was finally out in the open. I looked at my father, who was gripping my mother's hand so tight as if their shared history was the only thing that mattered. We walked out of that ballroom, leaving behind the sound of Anthony's desperate sobbing and the collective disgust of the people he had spent his life trying to impress. The world saw him for what he was, and more importantly, my parents saw that they were no longer alone in their fight. The air outside the gala hall was biting and cold, but it felt incredibly fresh and clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. I stood by the car and watched as Julian had his driver take my parents to the suite he had prepared for them. The confrontation of the night was over, but I knew the memories of the sawmill and the people we had lost still needed a final piece. I took the hand of my mother, and for the first time in 2 years she did not look over her shoulder for Tiffany. The silence after the storm carried the bitter taste of the truth we had lived, but it also carried the faint and beautiful scent of lavender that Julian had made sure followed us everywhere. It was the scent of liberation, and for the tonight it was enough. After the storm at the gala, we did not return to the luxury suite Julian had prepared for us. Instead, I drove my parents back to the place where everything truly began. The old Campbell sawmill on the outskirts of Denver. In the cold moonlight of the Colorado night, the weathered planks of the mill seemed to be waiting for us, ready to tell the story of what a real family is supposed to be. The air was heavy with the scent of aged pine and the dry dust of sawdust that still lingered in the rafters after all these years. I used a flashlight to cut through the darkness, and the beam landed on the old workbench of my father, Fletcher. Everything was still there, sitting in a silence that felt more like a sanctuary than a graveyard. I reached into a small wooden drawer and found the old compass my father used to carry. The glass was cracked, and the metal was worn, but the needle still pointed true north. This was the real legacy of my father, a reminder of finding the right direction, even when you are surrounded by the deepest woods. My mother Marine ran her hand over the deep scratches in the workbench and began to tell me about the early nights when they would build their first sets of furniture together under the glow of a single oil lamp. This nostalgia did not make them feel weak. It was as if they were finally touching the roots that Anthony had tried so hard to cut. I stood there in the quiet and remembered the advice my father gave me right before I left for my years of service. He told me that the strongest oak in the forest is not the biggest one, but the one with the deepest roots that can hold on when the wind tries to tear it down. I realized then that Anthony was like a tree with no roots at all. He was just a vine clinging to the image of wealth and a reputation that he never actually earned. My father Fletcher picked up an old chisel, and his hands did not tremble as he felt the weight of the tool. He looked at me and told me that I had done the right thing at the gala. He said I should not let the bitterness of my brother cloud the love they had for this place or the life they built. His steady voice helped me wash away the exhaustion of the struggle. I understood that I was not just protecting my mother. I was defending the heritage of an honest family. My mother Maureen began to whisper a Bible verse she always read when the sawmill was facing hard times in the past. She said, "Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength, and they will mount up with wings like eagles." She whispered that they would run and not be weary, and they would walk and not faint. Her voice echoed softly in the stillness of the mill, and it felt like a miracle of strength was rising up around us. In that moment, her faith and her pride joined together to create a spiritual armor for both of them. I felt like a child again, being wrapped in the safety of their love. It was a feeling that no uniform or rank could ever provide. We were not just victims of a cruel son anymore. We were the keepers of a story that was far stronger than any lie Anthony could invent. The first light of the morning began to peek through the cracks in the old tin roof, and I watched the dust motes dancing in the golden beams like tiny sparks of hope. My parents stood together in the center of the mill, and their shadows stretched long and proud across the floor. I held the old compass tightly in my hand, and I knew exactly which way we had to go. We walked out of the sawmill not to run away, but to face the final legal steps that would remove the shadow of Anthony from our lives forever. The memories of this place had become the strength we needed to finish the journey. We left the old mill behind, but we carried its heart with us as we moved toward the light of a brand new day. The warmth that Julian Blackwood provided was a much-needed sanctuary, but I knew in my heart that kindness alone could not finish what my brother had started. Love is a shield, but the law is a sword, and it was finally time for me to be the one to swing it. I realized that the sweet scent of lavender tea in a hotel suite could not replace the feeling of true ownership and safety that had been stolen from my parents. So early on Monday morning, I drove them to a high-rise building in downtown Denver, where the air was crisp and the shadows were sharp against the glass. We were there to meet with a legal team that specialized in elder law because it was time to perform a total financial cleanup and remove every trace of my brother's control over their lives. The office was on the top floor, and through the massive windows, everything below looked so small and manageable. We sat at a heavy mahogany table, and the atmosphere was quiet and professional, defined by the rustle of expensive paper and the steady ticking of a clock. Julian had connected us with the best in the state, and they wasted no time. The most important task was to immediately revoke the power of attorney that Anthony had used as a cage for 2 years. I watched my mother Maureen take the heavy fountain pen in her hand. Her fingers, which had once trembled while serving wine to strangers, were now steady and sure. She did not hesitate for a single second. She signed her name with a sharp and deliberate stroke, and as each page was turned, I felt as if a heavy iron chain was being cut away from her soul. She was no longer a victim waiting for permission. She was a woman reclaiming her position as the head of her own household. A wave of steel-like relief washed over me as the lawyers confirmed that the documents were filed. I had already worked with them to identify every credit card and account that had been drained. We found the records of the thousands of dollars Anthony had spent to maintain his hollow image while our parents suffered in the heat. Seeing those numbers in black and white was a moment of absolute clarity for my father Fletcher. He looked at the financial reports, and his voice was low, but it had that old resonant strength from his days at the sawmill. He said that he had given his son that business to build a future for the family, not to build a monument to lies and vanity. For the first time, I saw him truly look at the betrayal for what it was, and he decided that his son was no longer entitled to a single penny of their hard-earned peace. We were finally free from the fake kindness of a man who only saw them as assets. It was during this meeting that the lawyers revealed the final move Julian Blackwood had made in the shadows. He had quietly purchased every single debt and mortgage Anthony had secretly placed against the Campbell sawmill. Julian wasn't just helping us. He was handing the keys of my father's kingdom back to him, free and clear. Anthony's leverage had officially turned into his own financial noose. While we were at the office, the lawyers drafted a formal eviction notice for Anthony and Tiffany. It was a swift and non-negotiable directive to vacate the family home within 48 hours. I also worked with the banks to freeze every shared account that was suspected of being used for elder financial abuse. My phone did not stop buzzing with calls from my brother. His voice went from shouting threats to begging for mercy, and then back to insulting me with every word he could find. I did not listen to his excuses or his fake tears. I answered only once, and I used my most professional officer voice to tell him that he would receive a court summons in the morning. I told him never to call my number again. My coldness was not about anger, but about building a steel wall around my parents so that his toxic influence could never reach them again. I then took my parents back to their old house to supervise the changing of every lock and security code. We had a locksmith there within the hour, and I watched as the old keys that Anthony and Tiffany used were tossed into the garbage where they belonged. We installed a high-tech security system that only my parents and I could access. As the doors were finally secured, the house seemed to breathe for the first time in years. The smell of industrial bleach was slowly fading as my mother Maureen walked through the rooms and opened every single window to let the fresh mountain air in. I stood on the front porch and watched the service crews hauling away the trash and the clutter Tiffany had left behind. This was more than just a physical cleaning, it was a scrubbing of the soul for the space my parents had built together. I stood in the living room and watched my mother as she looked at a color palette to choose new paint for the walls. She pointed to a soft shade of sky blue and said that she wanted the room to feel as open as the horizon. She was no longer trapped in the gray shadows of the attic. She was making choices for herself again, and that was the greatest victory of all. In the backyard, my father Fletcher was already measuring the space where he wanted to set up a small woodworking shop. He was planning for the future, not just surviving the present. They sat down together at the kitchen table and signed a brand new will that ensured everything they owned would be handled according to their true wishes. They were independent citizens once more, and nobody had the power to force them into silence. The final step of the day was the most satisfying of all. I watched from a distance as a process server walked into the lobby of Anthony's law firm and handed the summons directly to him right in front of his colleagues and partners. The collapse of his hollow kingdom was starting with the very laws he had tried to manipulate. I stood there watching the scene with no pity in my heart because I knew that the justice being served was exactly equal to the suffering my parents had endured under his roof. My parents were finally liberated from his shadow, and they were ready to step into the final chapter of their lives with their heads held high. Justice is not just an abstract concept found in dusty law books. It is the physical sound of truth, finally pushing back against a lie. It was the sound of the legal system closing its doors behind a man who had forgotten the weight of his own conscience. It was finally time for Anthony to pay for every single sedative he had forced our father to swallow just to keep him quiet, and every bowl of thin, watery soup he had served our mother while he dined on steak. The truth was about to be dragged out into the bright Denver sunlight, leaving no dark corner for his deceits to hide. There is a specific kind of coldness that comes when a lie is finally stripped naked, and I felt that chill as we walked into the courthouse for the civil trial. I could feel the eyes of the city on us as we walked up those granite steps, my parents on either side of me, looking stronger than they had in years. The courtroom was packed with local media and the curious eyes of the city elite, because Julian Blackwood had ensured this story was not buried in a pile of paperwork. Anthony sat at the defense table looking like a ghost of the arrogant lawyer he used to be. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and his hands, which were usually so steady, were visibly shaking. Beside him, Tiffany spent the entire time trying to shield her face from the cameras, her designer scarf pulled tight, as if it could hide her shame. I stood at the witness stand providing a report on a failed command. I did not use emotion to make my point. I used the cold, hard data that could not be argued with. I presented the bank statements, the medical reports of the neglected health of my father, and the hidden video recordings of their lives on that attic floor. Each piece of evidence was like a heavy stone dropping onto the fragile glass of the reputation of my brother until it shattered completely. The room was heavy with the shock of the audience as they realized the depth of the cruelty hidden behind those mansion walls. Then it was the turn of my mother to speak, and the entire room went silent as she walked to the stand. Maureen did not need a lawyer to find the words for her. She used the clear and resonant voice of the retired schoolteacher. She was to tell the story of the invisibility that her own son had forced upon her. She told the jury that her pain did not come from the thousands of dollars stolen from her retirement account, but from the fact that her own child viewed her as a piece of refuse to be discarded. Her honesty was so raw and so pure that I saw several members of the jury wiping away tears. In that moment, my mother was reclaiming her voice and her pride in front of the entire world. I felt a deep and profound satisfaction seeing her stand tall, because I knew that her dignity was being restored in a way that no amount of money could ever buy. The verdict from the judge was as sharp and final as a gavel strike on solid oak. Anthony was ordered to repay every single cent he had taken, and he was hit with damages that were 3 times the original amount for his intentional malice. Most importantly, he was permanently stripped of his power of attorney, and the Colorado Bar Association issued a notice suspending his license to practice law, effectively ending the career he had built on the backs of our parents. I watched him collapse into his chair as the reality of his total failure sank in. He had traded his parents for a reputation that was now in ruins. Tiffany was forced to leave the penthouse we had frozen, and she walked out onto the street with only 2 old suitcases in her hands. It was a fitting mirror to the way she had limited the life of my mother to the dusty attic floor. The biggest punishment for Anthony was not the loss of his bank account, but the total contempt he now faced from the very society he had worshipped. Every partner and investor he had tried to impress turned their backs on him overnight. Julian Blackwood made it official when he stated that a man who does not respect his own parents is not a man who belongs in any professional circle associated with his corporation. As I watched the bailiffs lead my brother away to begin the processing of the judgment, I did not feel a single drop of pity. I felt the immense weight of fairness. He had planted seeds of cruelty for 2 years, and he was now harvesting the whirlwind. It was a clear and undeniable lesson in the power of consequence and the resilience of those who have been wronged. A few days later, my mother performed an act of restoration that moved me more than the trial itself. She decided to use a portion of the settlement money to buy thoughtful gifts for her old teaching colleagues and to make a large donation to a local charity for the lonely elderly. We went to the high-end shopping center at Cherry Creek, and I watched her walk through the bright aisles with her head held high. For the first time in years, she was not looking for the cheapest items or hiding near the back exits. She picked out beautiful hand-wrapped sets, and when it came time to pay, she pulled out her own credit card with her own name on it. She swiped that card with a steady hand and a bright smile, chatting easily with the clerk about her plans for the coming weekend. Seeing her move through the world with such confidence and light was the ultimate proof that the justice we fought for was real. We celebrated the homecoming with a small tea party in the rose garden behind the family house. The garden had been restored to its former glory, and the air was thick with the sweet and calming scent of fresh lavender and blooming roses. My father, Fletcher, sat in a new comfortable armchair, his hands resting on his lap, as he listened to his favorite old radio station. There was no forced laughter like the galas of my brother, just the pure and simple peace of a home that belonged to the people who built it. Julian Blackwood came by to join us, and he raised his teacup to my parents, welcoming them back to their own lives with the respect they deserved. The heaviness that had hung over us for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a lightness that made the Denver air feel like it was glowing. I sat down on the grass next to my mother, and for the first time in 12 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. I had taken off the heavy fabric of my major uniform and was wearing a simple, soft sweater, feeling the sun on my face. The weight of the years of distance and the struggle to save them had finally been set down. I looked up at the blue Colorado sky and realized that while I had been in many conflicts across the globe, this mission to protect my family was the most honorable thing I had ever done. We were whole again, and I knew that the darkness would never find its way back into this house. If this story of truth and light has moved you, please share your own moments of standing up for your family in the comments. I want to hear about your courage. And please hit that subscribe button and give us a like to support the continued fight for dignity and justice for all our parents. 6 months have passed since the shadows lifted, and the air in Denver started to feel like it belongs to us again. On a warm, late afternoon, the porch light of our home casts a golden glow over the roses. Inside the living room, my mother, Maureen, is leading a neighborhood book club, her voice steady and full of life. Out in the small woodworking shop, my father, Fletcher, is teaching a neighbor kid how to plane a piece of solid oak with precision. The name Maureen Campbell stands tall and proud on the mailbox at the curb, catching the rays of the sunset. There are no more raised voices or the haze of sedatives. There is only the smell of fresh cornbread cooling and the soft melody of classical music drifting from the radio. I sit on the porch watching my mother laugh, and I realize that true honor was never about the major rank on my shoulders. It was about the fact that I refused to let her stay invisible for even one more day. I spent my career protecting borders, but this home is the most important ground I have ever defended. Justice might take the long way around, but it always finds the path home if we are brave enough to keep the door open. My mother leans her head against my shoulder and she whispers that she can finally breathe again. To those listening, please never take the silence of your parents for granted. Your greatest success is not what you earn, but where you stand when the people you love are made to feel small. You deserve to be seen, to be cherished, and to sit at the head of your own table. Never be afraid to speak, because your dignity is a light that should always be allowed to shine.